In a world where trust was a luxury, Adrian Blake, a wealthy CEO, carried the weight of isolation. Yet, everything changed the day he met Lila Evans, a maid with trembling hands and a haunting secret. Little did they know their lives were about to intertwine in ways neither could imagine. Adrian Blake sat in his sunlit office, gazing at the sprawling gardens of his estate through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lush greenery stretched far, but his mind wasn't on the beauty outside. As the CEO of Blake Industries, a multinational empire, his life was a relentless cycle of boardroom meetings, acquisitions, and decisions that could make or break markets. But for all his wealth and success, there was an unshakable loneliness, a void he couldn't fill. Adrian was a man who had learned early that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Betrayal had come in many forms: friends who had stolen, partners who had lied, and a fiancé who had walked out chasing someone else's fortune. He wore his isolation like armor, keeping people at a distance and emotions locked away. But the soft hum of activity in the mansion barely registered, until a sudden crash echoed from the dining hall. Adrian's sharp eyes narrowed as he rose from his chair. His polished black shoes clicked against the marble floor as he walked out to investigate. In the hall stood a young woman, frozen mid-motion. Her hands trembled as she crouched to pick up the shattered remains of a porcelain teapot. She was slender, with auburn hair tucked into a loose braid and cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Her uniform, crisp but modest, marked her as one of the housemaids. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's gaze lingered on her longer than intended. There was something unusual about her, something in the way her hands trembled, not just with the anxiety of making a mistake, but with a deeper kind of fear. "What's your name?" His tone was calm but firm. "Lila, sir. Lila Evans." Her green eyes darted toward him, then quickly away, as if meeting his gaze was too much. "Are you new here?" "Yes, sir. I started last week." "Careful next time," he said, his tone softening slightly. As he turned to leave, he caught her murmuring, "It won't happen again." The words carried a weight, as though she wasn't just talking about the teapot. Over the next few days, Adrian found himself noticing Lila more often than he intended. She was diligent, always on time, and worked with quiet precision. But there was a guardedness to her, a constant vigilance that seemed out of place in the safe, insulated world of his estate. Once he spotted her in the garden staring at the sky, lost in thought. The expression on her face, a mixture of longing and sadness, stirred something in him. He told himself it was simple curiosity, but deep down, he knew it was more. One evening, as Adrian returned home late from the office, he saw her walking down the dimly lit hallway. She clutched a book to her chest and froze when their paths crossed. "Do you always walk around like a ghost?" he teased lightly. Her face flushed. "I didn't mean to startle you, sir." "You didn't, but you seem jumpy. Is everything all right?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with an emotion he couldn't place. "Yes, everything's fine," she replied too quickly. Adrian's instincts told him otherwise. Years of navigating corporate sharks had honed his ability to read people, and Lila's body language screamed that she was hiding something. But he decided against pressing her. For now. And the following morning, Adrian was reviewing some documents in his study when one of the senior housekeepers, Mrs. Collins, approached him. "Sir, I thought you should know something about Miss Evans," she began cautiously. "What is it?" Adrian asked, his brow furrowing. "She received a letter this morning. I happened to see the envelope. It didn't have a return address, but the handwriting was unusual." She looked pale after reading it, and when I asked if she was all right, she claimed it was nothing. Mrs. Collins hesitated before adding, "But the way she crumpled it and threw it into the fireplace." "I thought it odd. Adrian's curiosity deepened. Why would a simple housemaid attract suspicious correspondence? Was she in trouble? Or worse, was she bringing trouble into his home? Later that evening, Adrian was walking through the quiet halls of the mansion when he heard faint music. Following the sound, he found himself at the door to the servants' quarters. He paused, unsure why he was even there, when he heard Lila's voice humming a soft tune. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with sorrow and longing. It stopped abruptly when he knocked on the door. Lila opened it, her eyes wide with surprise. "Sir, is something wrong?" Adrian hesitated, feeling strangely exposed under her gaze. "I heard music. You were humming." "Oh," she said, looking embarrassed. "It's just a habit. I didn't realize anyone could hear." "It was nice," he admitted. "Do you sing?" She shook her head quickly. "No, not really. Just something my mother used to sing when I was a child." There it was again, that fleeting sadness in her eyes. Adrian wanted to ask more but stopped himself. "Well, keep it down next time," he said gruffly, walking away before the warmth in her voice could draw him in further. That night, as Adrian lay in bed, his mind refused to settle. He couldn't stop thinking about Lila, the trembling hands, the guarded looks, the letter in the fireplace. There was a story there, one she was clearly desperate to keep hidden, and despite his better judgment, he found himself wanting to uncover it. In his world of cold transactions and calculated risks, Lila Evans was an enigma, a puzzle he was determined to solve. The introduction concludes with Adrian growing increasingly intrigued by Lila. Her mysterious demeanor, combined with the hints of danger surrounding her, sets the stage for their connection to deepen, even as secrets and threats loom on the horizon. The golden rays of morning filtered through the windows of Adrian's estate as the house stirred to life. Adrian, sipping his morning coffee in the study, found his attention drawn to the security footage on his tablet, a habit he'd developed after a burglary attempt years ago. He hadn't planned on watching the staff, but something caught his eye. Lila stood by the back gate clutching a small envelope. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open, her face pale as she read its contents. Moments later, she stuffed the letter into her apron pocket and darted inside, her movements frantic. Adrian's instincts screamed at him. He replayed the footage twice, the unease in her body language fueling his suspicions. What was in that letter, and why did it frighten her so much? For someone trying to blend in, Lila wasn't doing a very good job. And that evening, as Lila set the dining table, Adrian appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding. She glanced up, startled, nearly dropping a wine glass. "Lila," he said, his voice even but firm. "May I have a word?" Her gaze flicked around the room, as if searching for an escape. "Of course, sir." He gestured toward the nearby parlour where they could speak privately. She followed hesitantly, her hands gripping her apron. Once inside, Adrian closed the door, the soft click amplifying the tension. "I couldn't help but notice something this morning," he began, leaning casually against the fireplace. "You received a letter." Her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and her hands twitched as if to shield her pocket. "It was nothing important," she said quickly. "Just a personal matter." "I saw how it affected you," Adrian countered. "It didn't look like nothing. If you're in some kind of trouble, I need to know. This is my home, and I won't tolerate any risks to its safety." Her lip trembled as she struggled to find her words. I swear I'm not bringing trouble here. Please, sir, just let it go." Adrian studied her, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of deceit. What he saw instead was fear. Raw, unfiltered fear. Against his better judgment, he softened his tone. "I can help you," he said, "but only if you tell me the truth." Her eyes brimmed with unshed tears, but she shook her head. "Thank you, but no one can help me." On the next day, Adrian asked his head of security, Mr. Grant, to investigate the envelope. Despite Lila's protests, Adrian couldn't ignore the danger she might be in. Mr. Grant worked swiftly, tracking down the postmark and analysing the handwriting. "It's from someone named Victor. No last name," Mr. Grant reported later that evening. "Postmarks from a city about 3 hours away. Looks like it was hand-delivered to the local post office." Adrian's jaw tightened. Whoever Victor was, he wasn't far. "Keep digging," he instructed. "I want to know everything about this man." Meanwhile, Lila went about her duties oblivious to Adrian's efforts, but her movements were more cautious now, her eyes darting nervously toward the windows and doors. Every creak of the floorboards made her flinch. She seemed like a woman haunted by invisible ghosts. That night, Adrian found Lila in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes long after the rest of the staff had retired. The kitchen was dimly lit, and the sight of her slender frame bent over the sink struck him with a pang of protectiveness. "You're working late," he remarked, stepping inside. She straightened, startled, and quickly wiped her hands on a towel. "I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," Adrian said, pulling out a chair at the small table in the corner. "Sit." She hesitated but eventually obeyed, perching on the edge of the chair like a bird ready to flee. "I'm not going to force you to tell me anything," Adrian began, his voice gentle. "But if you don't open up, I can't protect you." Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of trust. I was running from someone," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Victor." "Who is he?" Adrian asked. She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. "He's someone I trusted once, but he's not a good man. He hurt me, controlled me. And when I tried to leave, he threatened to kill me." Adrian's fists clenched under the table. The thought of someone hurting Lila ignited a protective fury he hadn't felt in years. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "He has connections," she said, her voice trembling. "People in high places. If I went to the police, he'd find me before they could do anything." Adrian's mind raced. Victor wasn't just a petty criminal. He sounded like someone with power and influence, a dangerous combination. "You're safe here," he assured her. "No one will harm you as long as you're under my roof." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away. "Thank you, sir, but I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Adrian said firmly. "You're my responsibility now." For a moment their eyes locked, and Adrian felt an unfamiliar warmth stirring in his chest. She was more than just a frightened maid. She was a survivor, fighting against impossible odds. And he was determined to protect her, no matter the cost. As the days passed, Adrian's resolve to protect Lila grew stronger, but the danger was closer than either of them realised. Late one evening, a black car was spotted idling near the estate gates, its driver obscured by the shadows. Lila spotted it from the kitchen window and froze, her blood running cold. Her worst fear had come true. Victor had found her. Adrian was immediately informed, and his calm demeanour belied the storm brewing inside him. "Double the security," he ordered Mr. Grant, "and find out who's in that car." But Adrian knew that increased security wasn't enough. If Victor was bold enough to show up at his gates, it was only a matter of time before he escalated. And Adrian wasn't about to let that happen. This section concludes with the stakes rising as Victor's presence looms over the estate. Adrian's protective instincts deepen, and Lila begins to trust him more, setting the stage for their bond to grow and for the unfolding drama to intensify. The black car lingered outside the estate for days, a menacing presence that sent chills down Lila's spine. She could barely sleep, her dreams plagued by memories of Victor and his threats. Adrian, on the other hand, was quietly devising a plan. One evening, after another tense day of surveillance and tightened security, Adrian summoned Lila to his study. She entered cautiously, her hands nervously clasped in front of her apron. His imposing figure stood by the fireplace, the warm glow of the flames casting sharp shadows across his chiseled features. "Sit," he said, his voice calm but commanding. Lila hesitated before lowering herself onto the leather chair across from his desk. Is something wrong, sir? Adrian took a deep breath, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. Lila, the situation with Victor is escalating. The car outside isn't a coincidence. He's here for you. Her face paled, and her hands gripped the edges of the chair. I didn't mean for this to happen. I thought I could keep him away. You couldn't have stopped this, Adrian interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. But we have options. I've spoken to my lawyers and security team. There's one way to ensure you're untouchable. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian hesitated, the weight of his next words heavy in the air. Marriage? The word hung between them like a thunderclap. Lila's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. Marriage! You! You can't be serious. I am, Adrian said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Legally, if you're my wife, Victor can't touch you. You'd have my name, my resources, and my protection. Lila stood abruptly, pacing the room with frantic energy. I can't let you do that. It's too much. You don't even know me. I know enough, Adrian countered. You're in danger, and I have the means to protect you. This isn't about romance or tradition. It's about survival. But what about you? She asked, her voice breaking. Marrying me would ruin your reputation. People would talk. I don't care what people think, Adrian said, his voice softening as he stepped closer to her. What matters is keeping you safe. So what's your answer? Lila stopped pacing, her eyes brimming with tears. I don't know. You don't have to decide now, Adrian said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. But think about it, because time is running out. Lila spent the next 2 days in turmoil. Adrian's proposal weighed heavily on her mind, not just for its implications, but for what it revealed about him. Beneath his stoic exterior was a man willing to sacrifice his own reputation to protect her. It was a kindness she wasn't used to, a kindness that made her chest ache with a confusing mix of gratitude and something deeper. Adrian, meanwhile, found himself watching Lila more closely. He told himself it was to ensure her safety, but the truth was harder to ignore. The way she carried herself, the strength behind her fear, the quiet moments when her beauty caught him off guard. It was all becoming impossible to overlook. One evening, Adrian found Lila in the garden, staring at the stars. The moonlight illuminated her face, making her look almost ethereal. He hesitated before approaching, his footsteps crunching softly on the gravel. You should be inside, he said gently. It's not safe out here. I couldn't sleep, she admitted, her voice tinged with exhaustion. I needed some air. Adrian stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. For a moment they stood in silence, the cool night air wrapping around them. Have you thought about my proposal? He asked, breaking the quiet. Lila nodded slowly. I have, and I'll do it. Adrian turned to her, his expression unreadable. You're sure? Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. If it's the only way to stay safe, I'll do it. Adrian nodded, his heart pounding in a way he didn't fully understand. We'll make the arrangements tomorrow. The ceremony was hastily planned, held in a private room at the estate with only a handful of witnesses. Lila wore a simple white dress borrowed from the wardrobe of Adrian's late mother, the fabric fitting her like it was meant to be hers. Adrian stood at the altar in a tailored suit, his jaw clenched as he tried to ignore the emotions swirling in his chest. This wasn't supposed to mean anything, it was just a formality. So why did his pulse race when Lila walked down the aisle? The officiant read the vows and Adrian found himself stealing glances at Lila's face. Her eyes were downcast, her expression guarded. But there was a vulnerability about her that tugged at his heart. When it came time to exchange rings, Adrian slipped a simple gold band onto Lila's finger. She hesitated before doing the same for him, her hands trembling as their fingers brushed. By the power vested in me, the officiant declared, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Adrian's gaze locked onto Lila's. "You're safe now," he said quietly, but in his heart he wondered if he was only telling her, or himself. The newlyweds barely had time to settle into their new arrangement before the first attack came. Late one night, the estate's alarms blared, jolting Adrian and Lila awake. Security footage showed two masked men attempting to breach the gates before being chased off by guards. Adrian stormed into the security room, his fury barely contained. "This ends now," he growled, his fists clenched. "Find out who sent them, and double the guards." Lila, standing in the doorway, felt her heart sink. She knew Victor wouldn't stop, not until he got what he wanted. And now Adrian was in danger because of her. And that night, as Adrian sat in his study, Lila approached hesitantly. She carried a tray with tea, her way of thanking him for everything he'd done. "You don't have to thank me," Adrian said as she set the tray down. "I'm your husband now. It's my job to protect you." Lila smiled faintly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I've never had anyone fight for me like this." Adrian reached out, his hand covering hers. "You're not alone anymore, Lila. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. For the first time in years, Lila allowed herself to believe she might be safe, not just from Victor, but from the darkness of her past. This section ends with Adrian and Lila entering into a marriage of convenience, the first step in their growing connection. The romantic tension simmers beneath the surface, while Victor's escalating threats keep the stakes high, setting the stage for further conflict and deepening emotions. The first few days after their rushed wedding were a whirlwind of adjustments. Lila, now Mrs. Lila Blake, found herself navigating a world she'd never imagined being part of. The title alone felt alien. She wasn't just a maid anymore, and yet she still felt like she didn't belong. Adrian had ensured that her transition would be as smooth as possible. He hired a personal assistant to help her with her new responsibilities and even had a modest wardrobe sent to her room. But Lila, ever modest, still preferred the simplicity of her old life. One evening, as Adrian returned home late from the office, he found Lila in the kitchen, baking. The smell of warm cinnamon filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, Adrian felt a sense of calm wash over him. "You're still working?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Baking helps me think." Adrian smiled faintly. "You don't have to do this, you know. You're not a maid anymore." "I know," she said softly, her gaze dropping to the counter. "But it's comforting. It reminds me of simpler times." Adrian stepped closer, his presence commanding yet gentle. "You don't have to carry this burden alone anymore, Lila. You have me now." She looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with vulnerability. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment they stood there in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Adrian's hand brushed against hers as he reached for a piece of warm bread, and the brief contact sent a shiver down her spine. She quickly pulled her hand away, her cheeks flushing. "Good night, Adrian," she said hastily, escaping the room before the intensity of the moment could overwhelm her. As the days turned into weeks, the relationship between Adrian and Lila began to shift. What had started as a marriage of convenience now carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something neither of them dared to name. Adrian found himself drawn to Lila's quiet strength. He admired the way she carried herself with grace, despite her fears, and how her smile, rare as it was, could light up a room. Lila, in turn, couldn't ignore the way Adrian's mere presence made her feel safe, or how her heart fluttered whenever he looked at her. One afternoon, as Adrian worked in his home office, he heard a soft melody drifting through the halls. Curious, he followed the sound to find Lila in the parlour, playing the grand piano. Her fingers moved gracefully across the keys, the hauntingly beautiful tune filling the room. "I didn't know you played," Adrian said, startling her. Lila stopped abruptly, her hands freezing mid-motion. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude. You're not intruding, he assured her, stepping closer. That was beautiful. It's just something my mother taught me when I was a child, she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. I didn't think anyone was listening. Adrian sat beside her on the bench, his closeness making her heart race. Do you ever play for yourself anymore? She shook her head. Not often. Life got in the way. You should, he said softly, his gaze fixed on her. It suits you. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment the rest of the world seemed to fade away. Adrian's hand brushed hers as he reached for the sheet music, and the touch lingered longer than necessary. The warmth of his skin against hers sent a jolt of electricity through her, leaving her breathless. Later that week, Adrian invited Lila to join him for dinner in the formal dining room. She hesitated, unsure if she belonged at the table with him, but his insistence left no room for argument. The atmosphere was intimate, the table set with flickering candles and a bottle of vintage wine. Adrian watched as Lila tentatively took her seat, her delicate features illuminated by the warm glow. You don't have to be nervous, he said, pouring her a glass of wine. It's just dinner. It's not that, she admitted, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. I'm not used to all of this. Adrian leaned forward, his gaze intense. You deserve this and more, Lila. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise. His words made her chest tighten, and she quickly looked away to hide the tears welling in her eyes. Thank you, Adrian, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the evening wore on, their conversation grew more relaxed. Adrian shared stories from his childhood, surprising Lila with tales of mischievous pranks and youthful adventures. In turn, Lila opened up about her love for music and the simple joys of her past. By the time dessert was served, the tension between them had shifted. Lila felt lighter, her laughter echoing through the room as Adrian teased her about her favourite childhood snacks. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen. That night, as Lila returned to her room, she noticed a shadowy figure lurking near the garden gate. Panic surged through her veins, and she quickly locked her door, her hands shaking as she called Adrian. Within minutes, Adrian arrived with Mr. Grant and a team of security guards. They scoured the grounds but found no one. You're safe, Adrian assured her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. I'll make sure of it. The sincerity in his voice and the warmth of his touch made her heart ache. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Adrian cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. You don't have to thank me, Lila. I'll protect you no matter what. Their closeness sent her pulse racing, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might kiss her. But instead, he pulled her into a gentle embrace, his strength grounding her as her fears melted away. The next morning, Adrian arranged for additional security and personally began overseeing the estate's safety measures. His actions spoke louder than words, and Lila couldn't ignore the growing feelings she had for him. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Adrian handed her a small package. Inside was a delicate necklace, a single emerald, set in silver. It's beautiful, Lila said, her voice thick with emotion. It reminded me of your eyes, Adrian admitted, his gaze locked onto hers. I wanted you to have it. As he helped her clasp the necklace, his fingers brushed against her neck, sending shivers down her spine. Their eyes met in the flickering firelight, and for a moment the weight of their situation disappeared, replaced by the undeniable pull between them. Adrian and Lila's bond deepening as their mutual attraction becomes impossible to ignore. Romantic moments and subtle gestures bring them closer together, while the looming danger keeps the tension high, promising even more dramatic twists in the chapters to come. Days passed with an almost deceptive sense of peace at the estate. Adrian's heightened security measures kept Victor's men at bay, but the threat loomed like a dark cloud. Adrian and Lila's relationship continued to evolve, each moment between them layered with unspoken feelings. One quiet evening, as they sat together in the parlour, Adrian noticed Lila staring into the flames of the fireplace, her expression distant. The light from the fire reflected in her green eyes, making them shimmer like emeralds. But there was a sadness in them he couldn't ignore. "You've been quiet," Adrian said, breaking the silence. Lila flinched slightly as if pulled from her thoughts. "I've just been thinking." "About?" he prompted, leaning forward, his gaze soft but intent. She hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "About everything. About you. About this. About how much you've done for me." Adrian reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers. "You don't have to carry this alone, Lila. I meant what I said. I'll protect you." Her lips trembled, and she quickly turned away. "You don't even know the whole truth," she whispered. "Then tell me," Adrian urged. "Whatever it is, I can handle it." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Adrian saw the weight of years of pain and guilt etched into her face. "You don't understand, Adrian. I wasn't just a victim, I was part of it." Lila took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. "Victor wasn't just my abuser, he was my partner. At least that's how he saw me." Adrian's brows furrowed in confusion, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "He ran an illegal smuggling ring," Lila explained, her voice trembling. "Drugs, weapons, anything that could make him money. At first, I had no idea. I thought he loved me. But when I found out the truth, it was too late. He already had me under his control." Adrian's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice calm. "What do you mean, under his control?" Lila's hands twisted together in her lap as tears welled in her eyes. He found out about my younger brother, Evan. He was only 16 at the time, living with me after our parents died. Victor threatened to hurt him if I didn't do what he said." Adrian's heart tightened in his chest as he imagined Lila, scared and desperate, trying to protect her brother. "So you stayed," she nodded, her tears spilling over. "I stayed, and I did what he asked. I helped him forge documents, set up fake accounts, anything to keep Evan safe. But it only made things worse. The deeper I got, the harder it was to leave." Adrian's hand tightened over hers, his voice steady but firm. "What happened to Evan?" Lila wiped at her tears, her voice breaking. "I managed to get him out. I sent him to a boarding school far away using fake papers so Victor couldn't track him. But it came at a cost. Victor, he found out and punished me for it." Adrian didn't ask how. He could see the answer in the bruises she tried so hard to hide and the scars she carried in her soul. For a long moment the room was silent except for the crackling of the fire. Lila braced herself for Adrian's anger, for the rejection she was sure would come. But instead he reached out and gently cupped her face, forcing her to look at him. "You did what you had to do to protect your brother," he said, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "That doesn't make you a bad person, Lila. It makes you brave." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she searched his eyes for any hint of judgment and found none. "But I lied to you. I put you in danger." "You didn't put me in danger," Adrian interrupted. "Victor did. And trust me, I've dealt with men like him before. He won't win." His unwavering support broke through the last of Lila's defenses, and she sobbed quietly as Adrian pulled her into his arms. He held her tightly, his hand stroking her hair as he whispered soothing words. "You're not alone anymore," he said. "We'll face this together." In the days that followed, Adrian became more protective than ever, doubling down on security and working with his legal team to find a way to bring Victor to justice. Lila, in turn, began to let her walls down, trusting Adrian in a way she'd never trusted anyone before. Their relationship deepened, the line between their arrangement and something real blurring more with each passing day. They shared quiet moments, morning coffee on the terrace, late-night talks by the fire, and each one brought them closer. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the estate, Adrian turned to Lila, his expression serious. "I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" she asked, her heart fluttering at the intensity in his gaze. "No more secrets," he said. "If we're going to face this together, I need to know everything, no matter how painful it is." Lila hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I promise." But even as Adrian and Lila grew closer, Victor's shadow loomed larger. One night, Lila received a phone call from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered, her heart sinking as Victor's chilling voice filled her ear. "Enjoying your new life, Lila," he taunted. "It won't last. You can't hide forever." Her blood ran cold as the line went dead. She knew Victor wasn't bluffing, he was planning something. And this time he wouldn't stop until he destroyed everything she held dear. When Lila told Adrian about the call, his reaction was swift. "He's testing us," he said, his jaw tight with determination. "But he won't win. Not while I'm here." Lila wanted to believe him, but the fear in her heart refused to be silenced. As much as she trusted Adrian, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle with Victor was far from over. Lila's devastating confession and Adrian's steadfast support, solidifying their bond while setting the stage for the looming confrontation with Victor. The stakes are higher than ever, with their growing love serving as both their greatest strength and vulnerability. The tension in the estate was palpable after Victor's threatening phone call. Lila couldn't shake the dread that lingered in her chest, but Adrian's unwavering presence was a lifeline. He spent more time at home, working from his study instead of the office, his top priority now ensuring her safety. One afternoon, as Lila prepared lunch in the kitchen, Adrian entered, his sleeves rolled up and a rare, easy smile on his face. "Let me help," he said, surprising her. She raised an eyebrow. "You? In the kitchen?" He chuckled, reaching for an apron. "Don't look so skeptical. I can handle a knife." Lila couldn't help but smile. "All right, Mr. Blake, let's see what you've got." As they worked side by side, chopping vegetables and preparing a simple meal, the tension between them began to melt away. Adrian fumbled with a tomato, sending juice splattering across his shirt, and Lila laughed, a sound that felt like sunlight piercing through a storm. "Okay, maybe I'm better at deals than dicing," he admitted with a sheepish grin. "Maybe," Lila teased, handing him a towel. "But you're trying, and that's what counts." Adrian paused, his gaze lingering on her. "I'd do anything to see you smile like that." Her breath hitched, and for a moment the air between them crackled with unspoken emotion. But before she could respond, Adrian stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't have to thank me, Lila," he said softly. "I'm just glad you're here." The days passed in a delicate balance of routine and anticipation. Lila found herself drawn to Adrian more than she wanted to admit. His kindness, his strength, and the way he seemed to understand her without her having to explain. It all made her heart ache with a mix of gratitude and something deeper. Adrian, too, was struggling with his feelings. Every glance, every touch, every quiet moment with Lila felt like a thread pulling him closer. But he was careful not to push her, knowing she was still healing from the trauma of her past. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Adrian handed Lila a leather-bound journal. "What's this?" she asked, running her fingers over the embossed cover. "I noticed you like to write," he said. "I thought this might help. Clear your mind." Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes. "Adrian, I don't know what to say." "Just say you'll use it," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "I will," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. As she opened the journal and flipped through its blank pages, Adrian's hand brushed against hers. The warmth of his touch lingered, sending a shiver down her spine. When she looked up, their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as though the world had stopped. The following weekend, Adrian planned a quiet dinner on the estate's terrace. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of gold and pink, and the table was set with soft candlelight and fresh flowers. Lila hesitated as she approached the terrace, feeling out of place in the simple dress she'd chosen. But when Adrian turned to look at her, the way his eyes lit up made her insecurities vanish. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Thank you," she replied, her cheeks flushing. They sat down to a meal prepared by the estate's chef, but the food was secondary to the conversation. Adrian asked Lila about her dreams, her favourite books, and the memories that made her smile. For every answer she gave, Adrian found himself falling deeper into her world. After dinner, they lingered on the terrace, the cool night air wrapping around them. Adrian offered her his jacket, draping it over her shoulders with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "Thank you," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the stars. "For what?" he asked. "For everything," she said, turning to face him. "For making me feel safe." Adrian stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You deserve to feel safe, Lila, and I'll make sure you always do." The intensity of his gaze sent a thrill through her, and for a moment it felt as though the walls she'd built around her heart were beginning to crumble. Adrian leaned in, his hand brushing against her cheek, but before their lips could meet, Lila pulled back, her emotions warring within her. "I'm sorry," she said, stepping away. "I can't. Not yet." Adrian nodded, his expression filled with understanding. "I'll wait," he said simply, "as long as it takes." And the moment of peace was shattered a few days later when Victor sent another message, this time in the form of a package delivered to the estate. Inside was a photograph of Lila and Adrian at their wedding, accompanied by a note scrawled in bold, menacing letters. "I'm watching." The threat reignited Lila's fears, but Adrian's resolve only hardened. "He's trying to scare you," Adrian said, his voice firm. "But he's underestimated us." Adrian doubled the estate's security, hiring additional guards and installing advanced surveillance systems. He also began coordinating with law enforcement and private investigators to track Victor's movements. "You're not alone in this, Lila," Adrian said one evening as they reviewed the security plans. "We'll get through this together." Lila nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. But deep down she knew the fight was far from over, and that her growing feelings for Adrian made her more vulnerable than ever. With Adrian and Lila's bond deepening as their attraction grows stronger and more undeniable. Romantic gestures and shared moments bring them closer, but Victor's escalating threats remind them that danger is never far away, setting the stage for the confrontation to come. The phone call from Victor echoed in Adrian's mind long after it ended. He could hear the malice dripping from Victor's words. "You can't protect her forever." Lila sat on the couch, her hands gripping the edge of her skirt as she watched Adrian pace the room, his jaw tight and his eyes dark with fury. "He's toying with us," Adrian said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "But I won't let him win." Lila's voice wavered as she spoke. "Adrian, you don't have to do this. If I left—" "No," he interrupted, his voice sharp but laced with concern. "You're not running. You've been running long enough. He needs to understand that you're not his to control anymore." His words struck a chord deep within her, and for the first time in years, Lila felt the flicker of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. The next morning, Adrian called an emergency meeting with his security team. Lila sat quietly in the corner, her presence a stark reminder of what was at stake. Victor had issued an ultimatum. Meet him at an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the city or risk putting Lila in danger. Adrian knew it was a trap, but he refused to back down. "We'll go prepared," Adrian said, his voice calm but commanding. "Grant, you'll coordinate the perimeter with our team. I want eyes on every entrance and exit. The police will be on standby. But this ends tonight. Lila felt a pang of guilt as she listened. Adrian, what if something happens to you? I couldn't live with myself. He crossed the room, kneeling in front of her. Nothing will happen to me, he said firmly, taking her hands in his. You've been through enough, Lila. Let me fight for you this time. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, his unwavering strength giving her the courage to believe in him. Before leaving for the confrontation, Adrian found Lila in the garden, where she often went to find solace. The moonlight bathed her in a soft glow, making her look almost otherworldly. Lila, he called softly, and she turned, her face etched with worry. Are you sure about this? She asked, her voice trembling. Adrian stepped closer, his hands gently cupping her face. I've never been more sure of anything. But before I go, there's something I need you to know. Her breath hitched as he leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. You mean more to me than I can put into words, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. When this is over, I want us to start over. For real. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she nodded, her heart swelling with emotions she couldn't contain. Come back to me, Adrian. I will, he promised, sealing his words with a kiss that was both tender and full of unspoken promises. And the abandoned warehouse was dark and foreboding, the air thick with tension. Adrian entered alone, his sharp eyes scanning the space. Victor emerged from the shadows, flanked by two burly men, his smirk exuding confidence. Well, well, Victor drawled, spreading his arms theatrically. The knight in shining armor. You've come to rescue the damsel? Adrian's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. This ends tonight, Victor. Walk away now, and maybe you'll have a chance at a fair trial. Victor laughed, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. You think you've won? She'll never be free of me. She already is, Adrian retorted, his voice steady. You don't own her. You never did. Victor's smile faltered, and he motioned for his men to step forward. But before they could act, Adrian's security team emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. Chaos erupted as Victor's men tried to fight back, but Adrian's preparations proved superior. In the midst of the chaos, Victor lunged toward Adrian, a knife glinting in his hand. The two men struggled, their movements frantic and violent. But Adrian's strength and training won out, and he pinned Victor to the ground just as the police stormed in. Victor spat venomous words as he was hauled away in handcuffs. This isn't over, Blake. You'll regret this. Adrian stood tall, his chest heaving, as he watched the man who had tormented Lila finally taken away. It's over, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Adrian returned to the estate just as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight casting a golden glow over the grounds. Lila was waiting for him in the foyer, her hands clasped tightly together. The moment she saw him, she rushed forward, her heart pounding. You're safe, she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around him. I told you I'd come back, Adrian said, his voice filled with quiet reassurance. He pulled back slightly, his hands resting on her shoulders. Victor's gone. He won't hurt you anymore. Lila looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with gratitude and love. You did this for me. You risked everything for me. I'd do it again, Adrian said softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. Because you're worth it. Her heart swelled as she stared at him, the man who had become her protector, her savior, and now, something far more. Without hesitation, she leaned up and kissed him, pouring all her gratitude and love into the act. When they finally pulled apart, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. Stay with me, Lila. Not because you have to, but because you want to. Always, she whispered, her voice steady and sure. In the days following Victor's arrest, the estate finally returned to a semblance of peace. The once constant tension that hung in the air was replaced by an almost surreal calm. Lila could finally breathe without fear, but the emotional scars Victor had left behind were harder to shake. Adrian noticed the shadows that still lingered in her eyes, even during moments of quiet happiness. One afternoon he found her sitting in the garden, her knees drawn to her chest as she stared at the blooming roses. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, sitting beside her on the bench. Lila offered a small smile but didn't look at him. "I keep thinking it's not real, that he's going to come back." Adrian reached over, taking her hand in his. "It is real. He's gone, Lila. You're free." Tears welled in her eyes as she finally turned to him. "I don't know how to feel. I've been running for so long, I don't know what it's like to just live." Adrian's gaze softened. "Then we'll figure it out together. You don't have to do this alone." His words, simple yet powerful, broke through her defenses. She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in a future beyond fear. As the weeks passed, Adrian began to notice changes in Lila. She started smiling more, her laughter ringing through the halls of the estate. She spent time in the garden, playing the piano, and even took up painting, a hobby she'd abandoned long ago. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner on the terrace, Adrian brought out a small, wrapped box. "What's this?" Lila asked, her curiosity piqued. "Open it," he said, a glimmer of excitement in his eyes. Inside was a set of keys. Lila's brows furrowed in confusion. "What are these for?" Adrian smiled. "It's for the gallery in town. I bought it for you." Her eyes widened. "Adrian, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted. "You've spent so much of your life hiding, Lila. You deserve a place where you can be yourself, a place where you can share your art with the world." Tears streamed down her face as she looked at him. "You've given me so much. How can I ever repay you?" Adrian reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "You already have." Adrian decided they needed a break from the estate and planned a surprise getaway to a secluded villa by the ocean. When he told Lila about it, her initial reaction was hesitation. "Adrian, you've done so much already." "Stop," he said, cutting her off gently. "This isn't about what I've done. It's about us. I want to spend time with you, away from everything." The villa was a dream, a sprawling property perched on a cliff overlooking the turquoise sea. Lila gasped as they arrived, the salty breeze whipping through her hair. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So are you," Adrian said, his voice low and sincere. Their days were filled with long walks along the beach, shared meals under the stars, and quiet moments of connection. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Adrian led Lila to a private spot on the beach. "I brought you here for a reason," he said, his tone serious yet tender. Lila's heart raced as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice trembling. He knelt before her, opening the box to reveal a delicate diamond ring. "Lila, you've changed my life in ways I never thought possible. You've shown me what it means to love, to fight for something real. I don't want to live another day without you by my side." Tears streamed down her face as he took her hand. "Will you marry me? For real this time?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, her voice full of joy. "Yes, Adrian, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger before standing and pulling her into a kiss that spoke of promises and a lifetime of love. Adrian and Lila's real wedding was a stark contrast to their first. It was a celebration filled with warmth, laughter, and the people who mattered most. Lila wore a flowing white gown, her auburn hair cascading in soft curls, and Adrian couldn't take his eyes off her. As they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. "You've shown me what it means to be brave," Adrian said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise to spend the rest of my life protecting your heart." Lila's voice trembled as she spoke. "You've given me a reason to believe in love again. I promise to stand by your side through everything." When they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, the applause was deafening. Lila felt a warmth she'd never known before, a sense of belonging that filled every corner of her soul. As the months turned into years, Adrian and Lila built a life together that was rich with love and purpose. Lila's art gallery flourished, becoming a beloved community space, and Adrian continued to thrive in his business while prioritizing their life together. They often returned to the villa by the sea, where they first began their life as a real couple. On one such trip, Lila sat on the porch, watching the waves as Adrian joined her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "You look happy," he said, sitting beside her. "I am," she replied, her hand resting on her growing belly. "I never thought I'd have this. A family, a home, a love like ours." Adrian leaned over, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You deserve all of it, Lila. And more." As the sun set, bathing them in golden light, Lila rested her head on Adrian's shoulder, content in the knowledge that she was finally free, not just from her past, but to embrace a future full of hope, love, and endless possibilities.